The docks lit up like a second sun, flames tearing through warehouses, devouring wood and rope and dreams. By morning, half the waterfront was ash, and Doyle's men were scrambling to keep their shipments from sinking with the tide. Luka stood at the edge of the chaos, the heat from the embers searing his skin even through the icy wind. He knew without being told, this wasn't an accident. Someone was sending a message. By afternoon, the message became clear. One of Doyle's men, a boy not much older than Luka, was found floating face down in the East River, his hands bound, a crude carving on his back. A warning, a promise, war had come, and this time it would not be quiet. Doyle gathered his men in the back room of the butcher shop, the air thick with sweat and anger and fear. Luka stood in the corner, silent, watching, listening. "They think they can burn me out," Doyle snarled, slamming his fist on the table. "They think they can scare us into running, but we don't run, we never run." Eyes turned to Luka then, sharp and expectant. He didn't flinch, he didn't need to. That night, blood soaked the streets. Luka moved like a shadow, swift and silent, his rage honed into something sharp and deadly. He told himself it was for Ana, for his mother, for the family that had been broken and remade in the fire of this city. But deep down, in the quiet places he didn't let himself name, he knew the truth. Part of him had begun to crave it. The control, the power, the way men twice his age stepped aside when they saw him coming, and that terrified him more than the blood. One night, after another fight that left the cobblestones slick and the air thick with copper, Luka found Ana waiting for him in the kitchen. She was pale, her hands trembling as she held out a folded slip of paper. "They gave this to me," she whispered, her voice breaking. On the street, Luka unfolded it slowly, his pulse thrumming in his ears. The paper was cheap, the ink smeared, but the message was clear. "We see you, we see her, stop or she's next." For a long moment, Luka just stared at the words, the candlelight flickering over his clenched jaw. Then, without a word, he tore the paper into tiny pieces, letting them scatter across the table like snow. But Ana saw the truth in his eyes. She knew this wouldn't end until one of them was gone. The city had taken too much, and now it wanted more. And Luka, God help him, was ready to give it everything, because in the brutal heart of New York, where blood was currency and fear was power, there was only one rule that mattered. You paid the price, or the city took it from you, and Luka Novak was done paying. But even as he swore his quiet war, somewhere in the shadows, another hand was moving pieces on the board, setting in motion a chain of events that would test every vow he'd ever made. By the time Luka saw the trap, it would already be closing. Snow had begun to fall, thin flakes swirling through the narrow alleys and settling on the rooftops of the Lower East Side like a false promise of peace. Luka stood at the corner of Delancey and Orchard, hands deep in his coat pockets, eyes fixed on the street that stretched ahead like a dark vein. It was quiet, too quiet for a city that never slept. Even the drunks seemed to have vanished, and that told him everything he needed to know. Something was coming. For weeks, the warnings had grown sharper, bolder. Men shadowing Ana when she walked to the market. Notes slipped under the door, messages carved into the butcher's delivery crates. "We see you, we see her." Each one a reminder that the walls of their world were closing in. Doyle called it pressure, Luka called it what it was. A hunt, and he could feel the teeth getting closer. The first blow came 2 nights later. Doyle's second in command, a man Luka had known since his first day in the shop, was found in an alley, his throat cut so clean it looked like a surgeon's work. No robbery, no message, just death. The second blow followed quickly. Shipments were hit one by one. Whiskey crates gone, gambling dens torched, men loyal to Doyle vanishing like smoke. Every strike was clean, precise, as if someone was always one step ahead. The city wasn't just bleeding, it was being gutted, and yet through it all, Luka couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't about Doyle or the gang wars or even the territory. It was about him. The trap snapped shut on a Thursday. Ana had gone to visit a neighbor, an older woman who had helped them when they first arrived. She was late coming back, too late. Luka tried to tell himself she'd stopped to talk, that the streets were crowded, that there was no reason to panic. But then he saw the hat. It lay in the snow just outside their building, small and woolen, the one she always wore to keep the wind off her ears. His blood ran cold. By the time he reached Doyle's shop, the message was waiting, a single card on the counter, written in that same cheap ink. Come alone, midnight, Pier 17, and beneath it, a single word that made Luka's vision blur. Ana. Doyle told him it was a trap. Of course it was a trap. Luka didn't argue. He just loaded his revolver, checked the blade he kept strapped to his ankle, and walked out without another word. The pier was empty when he arrived, the fog rolling and thick and heavy, muffling every sound. The river lapped against the pilings, black and cold, and somewhere in the distance, a bell tolled midnight. He waited, and then, from the shadows, a voice, smooth, mocking, "You've been busy, boy." Luka turned slowly. A man stepped into the faint glow of the gaslight, tall and thin, his suit immaculate, his smile sharp enough to cut glass. "I've heard the stories," the man said, circling him like a shark. "The butcher's boy who won't stay in his lane, the immigrant who thinks he can take what doesn't belong to him. Where is she?" Luka said, his voice low, steady. The man chuckled. "She's safe, for now, but safety, like everything else in this city, has a price. What do you want?" "What I've always wanted," the man said, stepping closer. "Loyalty, and a man like you, Luka, could buy a great deal of it with the right persuasion." He flicked his hand, and two men dragged Ana from the shadows. Her face was pale, her wrists bound, but her eyes God, her eyes were steady, fierce, unbroken. Luka's heart slammed against his ribs. "Join me," the man said softly. "Work for me, Ort." The barrel of a pistol pressed against Ana's temple. The choice was no choice at all. Luka dropped his revolver, the clatter of metal on wood echoing across the empty pier. "That's better," the man said, his smile widening. "I knew you'd see reason." For a moment there was silence, broken only by the rush of the river and the pounding of Luka's heart. Then the man leaned closer, his breath warm against Luka's ear. "Welcome to the family." But as the men dragged Ana away, Luka's eyes met hers, and in that brief, wordless exchange, a different promise was made. This wasn't the end, it was only the beginning, and somewhere deep inside, beneath the fear and the rage and the quiet despair, Luka felt it, the old fire sparking to life. Because if the city wanted war, he would give it war, and this time he wouldn't stop until every man who'd ever threatened her name was nothing but a shadow in the gutter. But even as that vow burned in his chest, Luka couldn't shake the feeling that he was already too deep, that every move from here on out would only tighten the noose around his neck. And in the darkest corner of his mind, a single, unspoken question clawed its way to the surface. Would love be enough to save them when the city itself seemed determined to devour them whole? The city never slept, but that night it felt like it was holding its breath. The streets were slick with rain, glowing under the weak light of the gas lamps. Every shadow stretched long and sharp like a blade. Luka moved through them like a ghost, his coat heavy with the weight of the revolver tucked beneath it, his mind burning with only one thought. Ana. 2 weeks had passed since the pier, 2 weeks of forced silence, of pretending to obey, of swallowing his pride, while every part of him screamed to tear the city apart with his bare hands. They kept Ana hidden, somewhere he couldn't reach, somewhere he couldn't even find. They gave him jobs instead, dirty jobs that left his hands stained and his soul blackened. He did them without a word, without a question, because every task completed bought him another day of her safety. But time was running out. The city was at war. Doyle's men clashed nightly with the rival crews that had been moving in like vultures. The docks were battlegrounds, the alleys graveyards. Every morning the papers dripped red with headlines of the dead, and still the man in the sharp suit, the one they only whispered about, sat in his corner office, smiling that cold, perfect smile at if every death were another step in a game only he could see. And Luka had begun to understand. It wasn't about money. It wasn't about power. It was about control, total, unrelenting control. But the man had made one mistake. He'd underestimated how far Luka would go when the woman he loved was the one thing left that mattered. The plan had taken shape slowly, built in stolen moments and quiet whispers with men Doyle still trusted. A map of the city, marked with routes and names, crates moved in secret, guns hidden in plain sight. Allies promised vengeance in exchange for loyalty, and now the night had come. By dawn, the city would either belong to them or burn with them. Luka met Doyle at the edge of the docks, the wind whipping hard off the river, carrying with it the scent of salt and smoke. Doyle looked older, thinner, like the war had carved pieces out of him and left nothing but sharp edges behind. "You're sure about this?" Doyle said, his voice low. "I'm done being someone's dog." Luka replied, his jaw tight. "We end it tonight, one way or another." The first strike hit just after midnight. The warehouses along Water Street lit up like kindling, flames roaring into the sky, painting the clouds orange. Men poured from the shadows, gunfire tearing through the night, the crack of bullets, and the screams of the dying echoing across the cobblestones. Luka moved through it all like a man possessed. Every shot precise, every step measured, his eyes always searching, always waiting for the moment he'd find her. And then, there she was. He found Ana locked in a small office on the second floor of the pier, side building that had become their prison. Her face was pale but unbroken, her hands bound but steady. "Luka," she breathed when he burst through the door, and for a moment, just a moment, the noise and the fire and the chaos faded into nothing. "We're leaving," he said, cutting her bonds, now, but the city wasn't done with them. The man in the suit was waiting at the foot of the stairs, his perfect smile as sharp as ever, a pistol gleaming in his hand. "You could have had everything," he said, his voice calm, almost pitying. "Respect, power, a future, and you threw it all away for her." Luka stepped forward, shielding Ana behind him. "I didn't throw it away," he said. "I took it back." The shot was deafening in the narrow hole. The man staggered, shock etched across his face as the life drained from his eyes. When his body hit the floor, it was with a sound softer than anyone would have expected, like the city itself was exhaling. But there was no time to savor it. The building was burning. The walls groaned under the weight of the flames, timbers snapping like bones. Luka grabbed Ana's hand, and together they ran, through smoke and fire, through the roar of collapsing beams, through the chaos of a city tearing itself apart. By the time they stumbled onto the street, coughing and gasping, the first hints of dawn were creeping across the sky. The war was over, or so they thought, because as the days turned to weeks, Luka began to realize that victory came with its own kind of cost. Doyle had taken the city, yes. The streets whispered his name now with the kind of fear reserved for kings and monsters. But kings didn't sleep easily, and monsters didn't live long. And Luka carried the weight of every life taken, every choice made, every piece of his soul he'd traded to keep Ana safe. Some nights, when the city was quiet, he'd sit by the window, the revolver heavy in his lap, and wonder if this was what survival really looked like. Ana would find him there, always, her hand warm against his shoulder, her voice soft in the dark. "We'll leave someday," she'd whisper. "Find a place where the city can't touch us, start over," and he'd nod because it was easier than telling her the truth. That there was no leaving, not really, because the city wasn't just a place anymore, it was in him. And in the silence, when the wind rattled the windows, and the streets outside seemed to hold their breath, Luka couldn't help but wonder. Was it victory he'd won, or just another kind of prison? And in that quiet, unanswered question, the story of the Gilded Age, the story of every man and woman who came chasing dreams and found only chains echoed like the tolling of a distant bell. The city changed, but it never softened. Streets that once devoured the desperate now gleamed with steel and glass, but beneath the shine, the same hunger pulsed. Luka and Ana's story faded into whispers, another immigrant tale buried under the weight of progress. Another pair of souls consumed by a city that promised everything and gave nothing for free. But if you listen closely, if you stand in the quiet corners of the harbor at night, you can almost hear it. The ghost of a ship horn carried on the wind, the shuffle of tired feet hitting the docks, the quiet prayer of someone who believed they'd made it to a better world. That was the truth of the Gilded Age. It wasn't gold, it was grit, it was blood and broken dreams, it was survival at any cost. And for every man like Luka who clawed his way to the top, there were 1,000 more who vanished into the shadows, nameless, forgotten, yet part of the foundation that built the city. Because in the end, the Gilded Age wasn't about hope or freedom or opportunity. It was about the price people were willing to pay, and the pieces of themselves they could never get back. And maybe, just maybe, that's why their stories still haunt us, because deep down, we know, the city didn't just belong to them. It belongs to us, too. The brutal life of a Gilded Age immigrants, the sea, was not kind that morning. The waves slammed against the side of the ship like fists, and the air reeked of salt, sweat, and the sour tang of sickness. But none of that mattered to Luka Novick, not the stench, not the hunger clawing at his stomach, not even the cold that seeped into his bones as he clutched the wooden railing and stared toward the horizon. Because out there, just beyond the line where the gray sky kissed the angry water, was America, the land of hope, the land of endless streets paved with gold, or so they said. Luka tightened his arm around his little sister, Ana, who slept curled against him. Her cheeks were hollow, her dress torn at the seams, but her lips curled into the faintest smile, even as she dreamed. He envied her. She still believed the stories their father told before the fever took him. She still believed this new world would be their salvation. Their mother sat on a crate nearby, her hands trembling as she clutched her rosary. She hadn't spoken much since they left the village, since the landlord burned their home and called it progress. She prayed now, her lips moving so quickly it was like she feared God might not hear her in this strange, endless expanse of water. Around them the deck was a tapestry of desperation, men with hollowed eyes and women cradling infants too weak to cry. Whole families who had traded everything, land, animals, pride, for a ticket to this floating coffin that reeked of dreams and death in equal measure. Luka didn't look at them. He kept his eyes on the horizon, trying to imagine what it would feel like to step off this cursed ship and stand on solid ground again. To breathe air that didn't taste like rot, to find work, maybe, and a place where Ana could grow up without fear of soldiers at the door. And then, just as the clouds thinned and the light broke through, someone shouted, "Land, land ahead!" A wave of sound rolled through the deck, cheers, sobs, prayers. Luka's heart lurched as he leaned forward, his knuckles white on the rail, and there it was, rising out of the mist like a promise carved in stone. The statue. Ana stirred in his arms, blinking sleep from her eyes. "Is it real, Luka?" she whispered, her voice barely a breath. He swallowed hard, his throat tight. "It's real, Ana, we're here." But even as he said it, even as the ship roared with joy, and the people wept at the sight of Lady Liberty, Luka couldn't shake the chill that crept up his spine, because promises, he knew, were dangerous things, and some were meant to be broken. Ellis Island was nothing like the dream. The building loomed like a fortress, its brick walls stained dark from the salt air. The moment they stepped inside, the smell hit them: sweat, fear, sickness, and something sharp, like bleach. Voices rose in a dozen languages, clashing and colliding until it was impossible to think. Names. The clerk barked, his pen scratching against the ledger. His eyes were cold, efficient, as he looked at their papers and at their faces, as if weighing their worth in a single glance. "Novik," Luka said, his voice steady even though his palms were slick with sweat. "From Dalmatia, 3 of us." The man barely looked up. "Occupation, laborer," Luka answered. "Healthy." Luka nodded quickly, even though his chest ached from the damp cold of the voyage. The wrong answer here could send them back, or worse, split them apart. He'd seen it happen on the ship. Families torn in two with nothing more than a wave of a hand. A doctor came next, his hands rough and impersonal as he examined them. He lifted Anna's chin, pried open her mouth, and frowned. Luka's stomach clenched. "She's fine," he said quickly, his voice sharp, protective. "Just tired from the voyage." The doctor's eyes lingered for a moment too long, but then he moved on. Hours later, when the doors finally opened and they stumbled onto the streets of New York, Luka thought for a moment that maybe, just maybe, the worst was behind them. The city was alive in a way he'd never imagined. Buildings that seemed to scrape the clouds, streets choked with carriages and people, men shouting from carts, hawking bread, fruit, trinkets, music floating from somewhere unseen. Ana laughed, a bright, startling sound in the chaos, and for a fleeting second, Luka allowed himself to believe the stories. But hope is a fragile thing. By nightfall, they found themselves in the tenements. The building leaned like a drunk against its neighbors, its windows cracked, its steps sticky with something Luka didn't want to name. Inside, the air was thick with the stink of too many bodies in too small a space. Rats scurried along the floorboards, bold and unafraid. "This is temporary," Luka whispered to Ana as they curled up on the narrow mattress, "just until I find work." But as he lay there, staring at the ceiling stained with water, and God knew what else, he couldn't ignore the sounds that filtered through the thin walls. A man's voice raised in anger, a woman crying softly, the faint, distant cough of a child that sounded too much like the fever that had taken their father. Outside, the city roared, and Luka began to understand that survival here would cost more than the price of a ticket. The next morning, he went looking for work. The docks were chaos men pushing, shouting, offering themselves for pennies a day. Luka shoved his way to the front, his voice hoarse from calling out, but the foreman barely glanced at him. "Too small," the man said, jerking his thumb toward the crowd. "Next." By the time the sun dipped low, Luka's feet ached and his stomach twisted with hunger. He'd managed to earn a few coins hauling crates for a grocer, but it wasn't enough. Not for rent, not for food. When he returned to the tenement, Ana was asleep, her thin arms wrapped around their mother. Luka sat in the dark, the coins heavy in his hand, and wondered how long they could last. The city was not what they had been promised. It was hungrier, meaner, and as Luka stared out the cracked window at the streets below, a thought began to take root in his mind. If the city wanted to break him, it would have to fight harder, because Luka Novik had not come all this way to die in a room that smelled like rot and regret. But he had no idea that survival in this city would demand a price far higher than he could ever imagine. And by the time he learned what that price was, it would already be too late. Morning in the tenement was not morning at all. It was a groan of pipes, a chorus of hacking coughs, the scuttle of rats across floorboards. The air was thick with the stale stink of too many breaths, too many bodies stacked like crates. Luka woke to the sound of his mother praying again, her whisper a thread of desperate hope weaving through the room. Ana stirred beside him, her face still soft in sleep, but there were dark crescents beneath her eyes. Hunger was carving its slow signature into her skin. Luka rose quietly, pulling his threadbare coat around his shoulders. The streets would be alive already, men jostling for work, women bargaining for scraps. He slipped out of the building, past the cracked stairs and into the morning fog that clung to the city like a secret. The chill bit at his cheeks, but it was nothing compared to the sharp bite of desperation in his chest. Down by the docks, men were already shouting. Foremen barked orders, boots slammed against wood, crates creaked under weight. Luka pushed forward, ignoring the shoulders that slammed against his. Too small, they said yesterday. Too young, too thin. Today he would not let them say it again. He shoved to the front, met the foreman's cold gray eyes, and did not blink. The man's gaze slid over him, calculating, and for a heartbeat Luka thought it would be the same dismissal. But then a shout from behind, a man dropping from heat or hunger, and the foreman jerked his chin toward the empty space. Work. Luka's chest tightened with something that felt dangerously like hope. The day was a blur of sweat and pain. His muscles screamed as he hauled crate after crate, the wood biting into his palms until the skin split. He ignored it. Pain meant nothing if it meant food. When the sun sank low and the foreman finally waved him off, a few coins clinked into Luka's hand. It was not much, but it was something, and something was more than they had yesterday. He hurried back through streets that pulsed with noise and shadow. Men lingered in alleys, eyes sharp, hands quicker. Women stood in doorways, painted smiles that never reached their eyes. The city breathed around him, hungry and restless, and Luka clutched his coins tight until the tenement door swallowed him whole. Anna's face lit up when he pressed a heel of bread into her small hands. She tore at it with wide eyes, crumbs scattering across her lap. His mother's eyes filled as she whispered another prayer, softer this time, the words carrying a thread of gratitude. Luka ate little, saving what he could for them, but the bread felt like victory in his mouth. That night, lying awake on the thin mattress, Luka let himself believe that maybe this was how it would be. Hard, yes, but manageable. Work, food, survival. It was not the dream they had been promised, but it was something. And something, in this city, felt like everything, but the city was patient, the city waited, and its hunger was not sated by quiet victories. The first time Luka saw him, it was by the docks in the shifting light of early morning. A man in a dark coat, his shoes too fine for the dirt beneath them, his hat tilted low over sharp eyes that missed nothing. Men moved around him with a mixture of fear and reverence, voices dropping to murmurs when he passed. Luka did not know his name yet, but he felt the weight of him like a shadow across his skin. By evening, Luka knew. Everyone knew Carsten Doyle, the man who owned the docks, the tenements, the streets themselves. Nothing moved without his word. Nothing, and those who crossed him did not stay long enough for their stories to be told. Luka avoided him at first, head down, eyes averted. He was nothing, invisible, but invisibility does not last in a city that feeds on desperation. One night, as Luka walked home with his coins tucked tight in his fist, a hand closed on his shoulder. He turned, and there was Doyle, close enough that Luka could see the faint scar that ran along his jaw like a promise. "You work hard," Doyle said, his voice smooth, his words heavy with something Luka could not name. "Hard work deserves more than crumbs. You want more, don't you, boy?" Luka's throat tightened. He thought of Ana, her thin wrists, her too large eyes. He thought of his mother, her quiet prayers that sounded more like apologies. And he nodded. Doyle smiled, slow and sharp, and pressed a folded note into Luka's palm. "Then come find me," he said, "when you're ready to stop starving." That night Luka sat in the dark of their room, the note burning against his skin. His mother's breathing was soft and even, Ana curled tight against her. The coins from the day's work sat on the table, pitiful in their smallness. Luka stared at them until the numbers blurred, until the reality of it pressed like a weight against his chest. Work all day, bleed, starve, repeat, forever. The city was not what they had been promised, but maybe, just maybe, there was a way to take what it owed them. Outside, the streets hummed with life and danger. Luka lay awake, eyes open, and wondered if he was already too far gone to turn back. He wondered if the price Doyle would demand was one he could bear. He wondered if survival in this city meant becoming something he no longer recognized. And deep down, where the hunger clawed and the fear whispered, Luka already knew the answer. He just did not want to say it yet, because the moment he did, there would be no going back, and the city would own him forever. The note felt heavier than the few coins Luka clutched each night, heavier than the hunger gnawing at his stomach. It sat folded in his pocket like a secret too sharp to touch, its weight pulling at him with every step. By the third morning, the paper was soft from his restless fingers, the ink smudged where his thumb had traced the name written there, Doyle. He told himself he wouldn't go. He told himself he could endure the docks, the aching muscles, the cracked hands, the endless cycle of work and bread and more work. But each night, when Ana whimpered in her sleep and his mother whispered prayers in the dark, the voice in his head grew louder. "Work hard," Doyle had said. "Stop starving." On the fourth evening, Luka walked to the address written in neat, confident letters. It was far from the docks, far from the tenements, in a part of the city where the streets were cleaner and the lamps burned brighter. Men in sharp coats stood by the doors of quiet establishments. Women with red lips and jeweled hair watched from the shadows. And in the center of it all, behind a heavy door marked with nothing but a brass number, Doyle waited. The room smelled of smoke and money. A single light burned low, throwing long shadows across polished wood and leather chairs that looked softer than any bed Luka had ever known. Doyle sat behind a desk, a glass in his hand, his sharp eyes fixed on Luka like a hawk sizing up prey. "You came," Doyle said, his voice smooth as the liquor swirling in his glass. Luka nodded, his mouth dry, his heart a drumbeat in his chest. "You work hard," Doyle said again, standing slowly, his presence filling the room. "But hard work without direction is wasted. Men like you, boys like you, they break their backs for scraps while others eat the meat." He stepped closer, his gaze never leaving Luka's face. "I can change that. I can make sure you never starve again, but everything has a price. You understand that, don't you?" Luka hesitated, the air thick in his lungs. He thought of Ana's thin wrists, his mother's tired eyes, the damp stink of their room in the tenement. He thought of the endless ache in his muscles and the hopelessness that sat heavy in his chest each night. "I understand," Luka said, though his voice barely rose above a whisper. Doyle smiled, slow and sharp, like a knife sliding free of its sheath. "Good," he said. The work started small, errands, delivering envelopes, no questions asked. Carrying packages to places where doors opened without a knock and men with hard eyes counted money in stacks taller than Luka's dreams. It was easy money, more than a week at the docks for less than a day's work. He brought home bread, meat, even fruit, and Anna's eyes lit up like Christmas when she bit into a fresh apple for the first time since they'd left the old country. His mother didn't ask where the money came from. She only stared at him sometimes, long and quiet, her prayers growing sharper, more desperate. But she said nothing, and Luka said nothing, and the city swallowed them whole. Weeks passed, the jobs grew heavier. Longer nights, darker streets, men who didn't look at him, not really, but who nodded once when he passed, as if acknowledging that he was no longer just another hungry boy in a line of hungry boys. The first time Doyle asked him to collect, Luka's stomach twisted. The man he went to was older, his hands shaking as he counted out the coins, eyes darting to the window as if the world might save him. Luka took the money with a hand that trembled only slightly and walked back through the streets, his chest hollow. When Doyle handed him his share, folded neatly into an envelope, Luka stared at it for a long moment before taking it. Survival, he told himself, survival for Ana, for his mother, for the promise they had crossed an ocean for. But at night, lying in the dark, he could still see the man's eyes, wide and frightened, the way his hands had trembled. The city had its claws in him now, he knew it. And yet each morning he rose and went where Doyle sent him, because the hunger that had once been in his stomach had moved, settling somewhere deeper, somewhere that whispered of more. One night Doyle called him to the back room. The air was thick with smoke, and the quiet hum of conversation from beyond the door. Doyle poured him a glass of whiskey and pushed it across the desk. "You've done well," Doyle said, his eyes glinting. "Better than most." Luka stared at the drink, his fingers tightening around the edge of the glass. "You want more," Doyle said, his tone not a question but a statement, sharp and certain. "I can give you more, but more means loyalty. More means you don't ask questions, you don't hesitate, and you don't ever, ever betray me. Do you understand?" Luka lifted the glass, the burn of the whiskey trailing fire down his throat, and nodded. "I understand," he said. Doyle smiled that slow, sharp smile again. "Good," he said. From that night on, Luka was no longer just running errands. He was in it now, deep enough that there was no turning back. The city that had once chewed him up and spat him out now opened its doors, but the cost of walking through them was written in blood and silence. Ana noticed first. She watched him with wide, wary eyes, her laughter quieter, her hugs shorter. His mother prayed louder, her voice raw with fear she could not name. Luka tried to ignore it, to drown it in the weight of the coins in his pocket, and the way the neighbors looked at him differently now, with a mixture of fear and respect. But late at night, when the city's roar faded to a low hum and the tenement walls pressed in close, Luka wondered what he was becoming, and whether, when the time came, he would even recognize the boy who had once stared at the horizon with nothing but hope in his chest. Because Doyle had been right, everything had a price, and Luka had only just begun to understand how steep that price would be. The city had changed, or maybe it was Luka who had changed, but either way, the streets didn't feel the same anymore. They pulsed differently beneath his feet, humming with a tension he could taste in the back of his throat. Every corner, every shadow, every whispered name felt sharp, dangerous, waiting. Doyle's jobs had grown heavier, and so had Luka's pockets. Bread wasn't a treat anymore. It was a staple. Meat appeared on their table every night. Ana was filling out again, her cheeks rounder, her eyes brighter, but her gaze lingered too long on the bruises that bloomed on Luka's knuckles. She never asked, but she didn't have to. She knew. The city didn't give without taking, and Luka was learning that lesson in ways that scraped at his soul. It started with a message that wasn't delivered on time, a man who thought he could take Doyle's money and disappear into the sprawl of the city. Luka didn't even know his name when Doyle summoned him, his sharp eyes colder than Luka had ever seen them. "You're quick," Doyle said, his tone flat, unreadable, "and you don't rattle easy. I need that tonight." Luka nodded, though his stomach turned to stone. He told himself it was just another job, a message, maybe a warning, nothing more. The man they were looking for was holed up in a crumbling building near the river, the kind of place where the walls peeled and the air smelled of mold and broken promises. Luka followed Doyle's men inside, his breath loud in his own ears, his hands damp even in the cool night air. They found the man in a corner room, his face pale, eyes wide and darting like a trapped animal. The others didn't hesitate. They dragged him to his feet, his pleas spilling out in a language Luka half recognized but couldn't understand. He tried to swallow the fear that climbed his throat like bile, but then Doyle's man pressed a knife into his palm. "Do it," the man said, his voice low, steady, as though they were talking about fixing a broken chair. "Orders are orders." Luka's hand shook. He stared at the man in front of him, the tears streaking his face, the way his chest rose and fell too fast, too shallow. In that moment, he saw his father broken by fever, clinging to life with hands that couldn't hold any more. He saw himself in that man's eyes, young and desperate and terrified of what was coming. His stomach churned, but the others were watching. Doyle would find out. He always found out. When it was done, Luka couldn't remember how he'd moved, only that the knife had slipped from his hand and clattered to the floor, slick and red, and that his chest felt empty, hollowed out by something that had no name. The city outside hadn't changed. The streets still roared with carriages and voices, the lamps still burned yellow in the mist, but for Luka, nothing looked the same. The sound of his own footsteps followed him like an accusation all the way back to the tenement. Ana was asleep when he slipped into the room. His mother's eyes opened, sharp even in the dim light, and for a moment Luka thought she could see the blood that still stained his hands, the weight of what he had done pressing down on him like anchor. She said nothing, only turned her face away, her rosary clutched tight in her thin fingers. Sleep didn't come that night. Every time Luka closed his eyes, the man's face stared back at him, pleading, accusing, broken. But when Doyle called again, Luka went. Because once you've given the city blood, it demands more. Weeks blurred into each other. Luka's name was whispered in corners now, his presence in a room enough to still conversations. The boy who had once begged for dock work was gone, replaced by someone harder, sharper, someone the city had carved into shape with its ruthless hands. And yet the hunger didn't fade, it only grew. With the money came respect, with respect came enemies. Men Luka had never spoken to spat in the street when he passed. Neighbors turned their faces away, whispering when they thought he couldn't hear. He told himself it didn't matter, that it was worth it, for Ana, for his mother, for the chance to climb out of the pit they'd been thrown into. But the city doesn't forgive, it doesn't forget, and it never lets go. The first sign of what was coming arrived as a note, folded small and shoved under their door. No signature, no explanation, just 3 words written in a hand Luka didn't recognize. Blood calls blood. He stared at the paper until the words blurred, until Anna's small hand tugged at his sleeve and his mother's voice cracked in prayer. He told them it was nothing, just a prank, but his stomach turned cold, and for the first time since Doyle had taken him under his wing, Luka felt the shadow of fear that had nothing to do with hunger and everything to do with the choices he had made. The next night, as he walked home through the narrow streets, someone followed him. He could hear the footsteps, measured, steady, always just behind. He turned corners, doubled back, slipped into alleys, but the sound was always there. When he finally spun around, ready to fight, the street was empty. Only the quiet hum of the city answered him. But he knew someone was coming, and this time no amount of money, no whispered prayers, no sharp smile from Doyle would be enough to keep the blood from spilling again. The streets had a way of remembering debts. Luka had learned that early. You could buy respect with fear, buy safety with money, but you could never buy silence. The city kept its own ledger, and sooner or later it came to collect. It started with whispers, names he didn't recognize muttered in corners as he walked by. Faces half hidden in the smoke filled rooms where Doyle's men gathered, conversations that stopped too quickly when Luka stepped into the light. He told himself it didn't matter. He told himself he was imagining it. But deep down, beneath the armor he'd built around himself, a seed of dread had taken root. The note under his door was the first sign. The footsteps behind him were the second. The third came on a rain-soaked evening, when the city's lamps flickered against the slick cobblestones and Luka found the body. It was one of Doyle's men, a man Luka had shared whiskey with, laughed with in rare quiet moments when the city loosened its grip. Now he was sprawled in an alley, his face unrecognizable, the word traitor carved into his chest like a warning. Luka stood there, rain dripping from his coat, the bile rising in his throat. Someone was sending a message. Someone who wanted Doyle to know that the balance of power was shifting. He told Doyle, of course. He always told Doyle. But the older man only leaned back in his chair, a cigarette balanced between two fingers, his sharp eyes glinting in the dim light. "This city is built on blood," Doyle said, his voice calm, almost amused. "Sometimes it's ours, sometimes it's theirs. The trick, boy, is to make sure it's not yours." Luka nodded, but the words didn't soothe him, not this time. The following nights blurred together, more bodies. Men disappearing, streets that had once felt dangerous now felt like open graves. Luka slept less, ate less, his nerves stretched so tight they hummed with every sound, every shadow. And then it came for him. He was leaving one of Doyle's quiet houses on the edge of the city when it happened. The street was empty, slick with mist, the only sound the echo of his own footsteps. He didn't hear them until it was too late. Hands closed around him, rough and unyielding. A voice hissed in his ear, foreign words laced with venom, and then the world erupted in pain. Fists, boots, the sharp crack of bone meeting wood. He fought, but there were too many of them, shadows with no faces, rage with no names. When they left him, Luka lay broken in the gutter, the taste of blood thick in his mouth, the city spinning above him. He dragged himself home, every step agony, his vision blurring. Anna's scream when she saw him cut through the haze. His mother's hands shook as they cleaned the wounds, her prayers frantic, choked with tears. Luka said nothing. He couldn't. Shame sat heavy in his chest, heavier even than the pain. The next day, Doyle came. He stood in the doorway of their tiny room, his coat immaculate despite the filth of the tenement, his eyes sharp as ever. "You're learning," Doyle said, his tone almost approving. "Now you know what it costs. You want to stay standing in this city, boy. You want to protect them." His gaze flicked to Ana, to his mother, before returning to Luka. "Then you take the fight back to them. You make them bleed before they make you disappear." Luka said nothing, but his hands clenched at his sides. That night he went back to Doyle's world, back to the smoke, filled rooms, the quiet plans whispered over maps and ledgers. Back to the streets where blood was currency and silence was survival, and the city, greedy and patient, welcomed him back. The first time Luka pulled the trigger, he felt nothing, no guilt, no shame, only the quiet hum of inevitability. The man fell, the sound loud in the narrow alley, and Luka stood there breathing hard, the gun warm in his hand. When he returned home, Ana stared at him for a long time, her wide eyes searching his face for the boy she had once known. She didn't find him. The city had taken him, piece by piece, until there was nothing left to recognize. Weeks turned into months. Luka rose higher in Doyle's world, his name spoken with something like fear, something like respect. The boy who had once begged for dock work was gone, replaced by someone harder, someone the streets had carved into a weapon. But the higher he climbed, the sharper the edge beneath him, Allies whispered in corners, rivals circled like wolves. And always, always, the city watched, waiting for the moment it would take back everything it had given. The night it came was quiet, almost peaceful. Luka was walking home, the mist curling low around his feet, when he saw the figure standing in the shadows near the tenement door. Not Doyle, not one of Doyle's men, someone else. Someone who smiled when their eyes met, a smile that promised nothing good. And in that instant, Luka understood what the city had been trying to tell him all along. No one survives forever. The figure didn't move at first, just stood there in the dim glow of the street lamp, that faint, unsettling smile carved into his face. Luka's footsteps slowed, every instinct screaming for him to turn back, to vanish into the maze of alleyways behind him. But running in this city was as good as an invitation. It told the predator you were prey. So Luka straightened his shoulders and walked forward, forcing his expression into the cold mask he had learned from Doyle's men. The stranger stepped out of the shadows, and the first thing Luka noticed was his coat, too clean, too fine, the kind of coat that belonged to a man who didn't work for his bread. His eyes were sharp, calculating, like a man weighing and measuring everything he saw. "You're Luka Novik," the man said, his voice smooth as silk, laced with something that set Luka's teeth on edge. "Depends who's asking," Luka said, his voice flat, steady, though his pulse thundered in his ears. The man smiled again, but there was no warmth in it. "Let's just say someone's been watching you. Someone who thinks a boy with your talents might be better off choosing a different side." Luka didn't respond. He didn't need to. The man stepped closer, the faint scent of expensive tobacco clinging to his coat, and lowered his voice. "Doyle won't last forever," he said. "Men like him never do, but men like you, men who know when to move, when to shift their loyalties, those men survive, those men rise." And then, just like that, he was gone, a shadow melting into the deeper shadows, leaving Luka standing there, the cold night pressing in around him. Inside the tenement, Ana slept curled up beneath a thin blanket, her breathing soft and even. His mother sat by the window, her rosary clutched tight in her hands, her lips moving silently. Luka didn't tell them about the man. He couldn't, not because he wanted to protect them, though that was part of it, but because saying the words out loud would make it real. The city was shifting. He could feel it. Power moving like a tide beneath the streets, dangerous and unpredictable. And Luka was caught in the pull, whether he wanted to be or not. Doyle noticed too. The next morning, Luka found himself in Doyle's office, the older man pacing like a caged animal, his sharp eyes darting to the window every few seconds. "Someone's testing me," Doyle said, his voice tight, controlled but edged with fury. "Someone thinks they can take what's mine, but they're wrong, dead wrong, and you, boy," he jabbed a finger toward Luka, "you're going to help me remind them." Luka nodded. "Because that's what you did with Doyle." You nodded. "You didn't argue. You didn't hesitate." Not if you wanted to keep breathing. The days that followed were a blur of violence. Streets that had once been tense now burned with open war. Men Luka had known for months were cut down in alleys, their bodies left where they fell. Territory shifted like sand, claimed and reclaimed in a brutal dance that left blood running into the gutters. Luka became Doyle's blade, sharp and unflinching. He told himself it was survival, that everything he did was for Ana, for his mother, for the promise of something better. But in the quiet moments, those rare slivers of silence when the city's roar dimmed, he could feel the weight of it pressing down on him. Blood on his hands that never seemed to wash away, eyes that haunted his dreams, the gnawing fear that the boy he had been was gone, swallowed whole by the man the streets had made. One night, after a job that left another name carved off the city's map, Luka found himself standing by the river. The water was black, reflecting the dull glow of the gas lamps, and for a moment he let himself imagine what it would be like to walk in and keep walking until the city and its noise and its endless hunger were just a memory. But then he thought of Anna, thought of her small hands clutching the ribbon he'd bought her, thought of his mother's thin smile when he brought home enough food to fill the table. He turned away from the river and went back to Doyle. The power came with money, with respect, with doors that once slammed in his face now swinging open without hesitation. But it also came with isolation. The neighbors didn't look at him anymore. The men he worked with nodded when he passed, but their eyes were cold, calculating, as if they were always measuring when his time might come. Even Anna had grown quiet. She still smiled when he brought her sweets, still hugged him tight when he came home, but there was a sadness in her eyes now, a heaviness she didn't have the words for. One night, as Luka sat at the table counting Doyle's money, she slipped into the room and stood in the doorway. "You're different," she said softly, her voice almost too quiet to hear. Luka froze, the bills in his hand blurring. He wanted to tell her she was wrong, that he was the same brother who had carried her across the deck of that ship, who had promised her that America would save them. But the words caught in his throat, heavy with lies. He didn't answer, and after a moment Anna turned and walked away, her small shoulders stiff. The city had given him power, but it was taking everything else in return, and deep down Luka knew that sooner or later the weight of it would crush him. The question was whether it would take Anna and his mother with him when it did. The first snow of the season fell like ash over the city, silent and heavy, muting the clamor of the streets. Luka watched from the corner of Doyle's office window, the white flakes settling on rooftops blackened with soot, on streets stained with old blood. It should have been beautiful, but to Luka it felt like a shroud, a city dressing itself for a funeral no one had yet named. Doyle was restless. The war for territory had dragged on for weeks, each side bleeding but neither breaking. Luka had become his shadow, moving with the precision and silence that earned him quiet nods from the older men and sharp, appraising looks from the new ones. They whispered his name now, Luka Novak, like a warning and a promise all at once. But power was a poison that never stayed contained. One evening, as Luka walked home through the narrow back streets, he heard the laughter, first light, sharp, cruel. Then the sound of something breaking. He turned the corner and saw them. 3 boys, older, their coats patched but their smirks smug, cornering a smaller figure against the wall. Anna, her face was pale, her small hands clutching the basket she'd been carrying. One of the boys grabbed it, yanking it from her grip, spilling what little food she'd managed to buy across the filthy snow. Something inside Luka snapped. By the time the boys realized who he was, it was too late. The alley erupted into chaos, fists, snarls, the sickening crack of bone meeting bone. When it was over, 2 of them lay groaning in the snow, the third running, his breath ragged with terror. Anna stared at him. Why? Died, her basket abandoned at her feet. Blood dripped from Luka's knuckles, steaming in the cold air. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rough, harsher than he meant. She shook her head slowly, but her eyes didn't leave his hands. From that day, something changed between them. She didn't sit at the table with him anymore when he counted Doyle's money. She didn't meet his eyes when he spoke. It wasn't fear, exactly, more like she'd begun to understand something about her brother, something she didn't have the words for, but felt deep in her bones. Their mother prayed more often, her whispered words filling the small apartment like smoke. Luka could feel her gaze on him sometimes, heavy and searching, as if she too sensed the darkness tightening its hold. Then came the night that tore whatever fragile peace they had left. Doyle had sent Luka to collect a debt, nothing unusual, just another night in a city that fed on other people's pain. But when he returned, the building was too quiet. The door to their apartment hung open, a splintered frame the only sign of the violence that had come before. Inside, everything was chaos: broken dishes, overturned chairs, the smell of fear sharp in the air, and no sign of Ana. Luka's world tilted, his pulse a roar in his ears. His mother sat in the corner, her rosary clutched so tight her knuckles were white, her face streaked with tears. She tried to speak, her words tumbling out in broken sobs, but Luka didn't need to hear them. He already knew. Someone had taken her. The city had rules, even in its lawlessness, and Luka knew what this meant. Someone was making a move. Someone had dared to touch what was his. Doyle didn't hesitate. They want to draw me out, Doyle said, his voice cold as ice. They think using her will break you. They think it will break me. But they've just signed their own death warrant. Luka listened, the words washing over him, empty and meaningless against the deafening roar in his head. The only thing that mattered was Ana. The only thing that mattered was getting her back. The days that followed were a blur of violence and desperation. Luka tore through the city like a storm, chasing whispers, trading favors, leaving fear in his wake. Every door he kicked in, every man he left broken on the floor, brought him closer but never close enough. Until finally, a name, a rival gang, one that had been circling Doyle's territory for months, hungry and reckless. They hadn't taken Ana to bargain. They'd taken her to send a message. The night Luka found them, the city was quiet, the snow falling again, muffling the sound of his boots on the cobblestones. The building loomed ahead, its windows dark, its walls graffiti, stained and crumbling. Inside, the air stank of cheap liquor and stale smoke. And then he heard her voice, faint, trembling, calling his name. The rage that had been simmering in Luka's veins for days ignited, white, hot, and blinding. What happened next was a blur of motion and violence, a symphony of screams and shattering bone. When it was over, the room was silent except for Ana's quiet sobs. He gathered her in his arms, her small frame shaking against his chest, and for the first time in weeks, Luka felt something other than rage. Relief, raw and jagged, but real. But as they walked home through the snow, the city silent around them, Luka couldn't shake the truth that had settled in his gut. This wasn't over. The city had taken something from him, and even though he'd gotten Ana back, the balance had shifted. There would be no going back to what they'd been before, no going back to innocence, and somewhere in the shadows of the city, someone was watching, waiting, because in this city nothing came without a price, and Luka had just raised the stakes higher than ever. The winter wind howled through the crooked streets of the Lower East Side like a wounded animal, sharp and bitter, cutting through the thin walls of their tenement. Luka sat alone in the dark kitchen, the flicker of a single candle casting restless shadows on the peeling wallpaper. Ana slept in the next room, her quiet breaths a fragile reminder that she was home, that she was safe. For now, but Luka knew better. In New York, safety was a lie people told themselves to keep from going mad. Doyle's words echoed in his mind. This city doesn't forgive, boy. It remembers, always. And Luka had given it plenty to remember. The gang he'd torn apart to get Ana back had been small, desperate, nothing more than a splinter on Doyle's map. But their deaths had drawn attention. Powerful men had begun whispering his name, not in warning, but in interest. The butcher boy who'd grown sharp edges, who moved through the city like a ghost, who killed without hesitation but never without reason. Some saw opportunity, others saw threat, and all of them, Luka knew, would come calling. The first to arrive was O'Malley. Big man, big voice, bigger appetite for trouble. He leaned in Doyle's office doorway like he owned the place, his grin wide but his eyes cold. "You've got yourself a fine hound there," O'Malley said, nodding toward Luka, fast, mean, knows how to bite. Doyle didn't look up from his ledger. He's not for sale. Everything's for sale, O'Malley said, his grin widening, especially loyalty. Luka said nothing. He didn't need to. His silence was answer enough, and O'Malley chuckled as he pushed off the doorframe, muttering something under his breath about boys who thought they were men. But Luka wasn't thinking about O'Malley. He was thinking about Ana, about the way she flinched whenever there was a knock at the door, the way her laughter, once quick and bright, had gone quiet. The city had stolen something from her, something Luka couldn't get back, no matter how many men he put in the ground. And that truth burned deeper than any wound. Then came the night that would change everything. It started with a fire.